And so doubts do play a massive part of the scriptures, and we shouldn't be ashamed of them or afraid of them in the context of our own Christian lives or in the context of the church. But what is doubt when you really think about it? Nagging questions and uncertainty in ourselves. I think a good way of understanding doubt is when there is a distance between what we're experiencing and what we think. When our lives and our emotions and our circumstances don't measure up or match up with certain things that we think we know are true. And so doubts can exist for a number of reasons. Not all doubts are equal, shall we put it like that? Perhaps we doubt because we lack all of the information. Perhaps we doubt sometimes because we've believed or taken on board some sort of misinformation. Or maybe our doubts are a result of us being fearful that the information that we have leads us somewhere we don't want to go. Consider, for example, a doubt over Jesus really rising from the dead. Did Jesus really rise to true life again from the dead? You could doubt that. Perhaps you do doubt that. Perhaps you have doubted that. Perhaps that question has never come up, and now that I've mentioned it, it's there and it's lodged in your brain and it's one you're going to be asking. Well, you could doubt the reality, the validity of Jesus' rising to life again from death because you lack all the information. No one has ever shared with you the overwhelming evidence that that really happened, the changed lives of the disciples, the number of references and corroborating evidence from different sources that we have, the fact that there is no evidence that a body was ever found or presented, and that all of the other explanations don't hold water. And so you doubt because you just haven't had all of the information yet. And when you seek that information, when you find that information, well then the question goes away. The distance shortens between what you know and what you're living. On the other hand, you could be doubting the reality of the resurrection, of Jesus' rising to life again, because you've heard someone say something that's untrue, and you've believed that. For example, it's been suggested that the idea of Jesus rising to life again was something that was invented years, centuries down the line and added to the gospel accounts. People make that sort of proclamation, but it's not true. The fact of the matter is that the very earliest records, even letters written by Paul within a lifetime of those who had witnessed the resurrection, contain the important news that Jesus truly rose to life again. And while people might spread misinformation elsewhere, you needn't believe in those. So you might doubt because you've heard something that isn't true, that it's actually a lie. Or you might doubt, the third reason, because you don't really like where that truth leads. You haven't heard any lies about Jesus' resurrection. You might have heard someone like myself or Jamie waxing lyrical about the evidence for the resurrection, but it still doesn't sit right with you because you don't like where it leads. You don't like where it implies. If he rose, he must be who he said he was, and that must mean that there is a God of heaven to whom we are each answerable to. And you don't like that idea. See, our doubts can come from lots of different places. You could put it like this: sometimes we're just oblivious, and that's why we have our questions. Sometimes we're confused, and that's why we have our questions. Sometimes we're just weak, unwilling, unable to follow the evidence where it leads. This morning, I just want to quickly run over some suggestions of what we should do when we doubt, of how we should proceed when we have questions that we feel like we can't find sensible or reasonable answers for. And I'm going to suggest that we do three things. Firstly, Don't hide those questions. Secondly, question our own assumptions. And thirdly, come to him who is the truth. Firstly, don't hide those questions. All the examples I've kind of given you this morning of those people in the book of Psalms, of John the Baptist, of Peter, of these disciples gathered here, they are all proof that shoving it down, trying to put a lid on it and live life and pretend as if we have no doubts and we have no questions is not really an option. You might have been advised really poorly in the past just to have faith. There are some things that we just need to close our eyes and to have faith about. Well, let me tell you, someone who suggests that's a reasonable way forward doesn't truly know what faith is. What they mean is that we need to just have a larger imagination. We just need to be able to make something more up in our mind. Because faith is not the absence of reason. Faith is not the absence of thought. Faith is reason and thought that is able to go beyond appearances. The Bible never calls us, invites us to turn off our minds and to shut our eyes and blindly believe. No, it's a book of evidence. It's a book of truth that can be received and weighed and responded to. And so the first thing I would say when it comes to doubts and questions in our own lives and in the life as the church, that we should be willing to ask these questions. We should be open about them. We should have enough confidence and faith already in Jesus as the truth to be able to bring our questions and to find suitable answers. But in so doing, we need to, step 2, be willing to question our own assumptions, to be willing to question the knowledge that we think that we already have. If there is a distance between our experience, our existence, our emotions, and the things that we think we know are true, then obviously there's a missing piece. Perhaps we've believed something falsely. Perhaps we've assumed something that we needn't or shouldn't have assumed. You know, honestly, as Christians, we can cause ourselves a lot of pain, a lot of anguish, a lot of heartache and soul searching when we come to God's word and we make massive assumptions about it and its content, and we're wrong on those assumptions. The distance isn't between us and what God declares, but us and what we think God should be declaring, perhaps. Our doubts are because we're standing on shaky ground. And it isn't any wonder sometimes that we feel motion sick. You know, if we're willing to come and to ask our questions, usually big questions, usually important questions that we feel them of God, then we need to be willing to have those answers reveal something about us, something found wanting and lacking in us. If you really have doubts, then come with them. Ask them loudly, but humbly. Humbly willing to accept that perhaps there's something missing in our knowledge or our desires. And that is why we feel the way we do. But thirdly, and I have to say most importantly, if we've done those first 2 steps, then this is the one that brings it all together. You should bring your questions to him. Bring your doubts to him. Very often we find it easy and comfortable to lob questions, to lob problems, to lob situations at other people, at other believers, and feel a sense of, oh, I've won the day if they can't answer immediately the questions we have. Sometimes that's helpful. You might kind of come across someone who can calmly, coolly, helpfully respond and answer, spot the misinformation, spot where information is lacking, spot perhaps where you're unable to move and they can help you work through that. Great. That is wonderful when that happens. But our questions really are questions that need to be addressed to him, to the one who is truth, to our God in heaven, I mentioned Psalm 73. Go away, have a read of Psalm 73. It's a wonderful psalm of someone who believed something about God and whose life seemed to be teaching him something different. It's a wonderful psalm of being open and honest about the struggle that produced, the friction in their own lives. But it's also a wonderful psalm that shows us that this person was willing to come into the temple, to bring these doubts and these questions and these frustrations into the presence of God in order to find their answers. Think of John the Baptist there, stuck in prison, confused about how Jesus would be the one coming after, who would restore the kingdom, who would fix all things, who would conquer and defeat the enemies. And he sat there in prison and he is facing death. What does he do with that? He sends people to go and question Jesus, not to stew in it on his own in his prison cell, but to go and to find out and to hear from Jesus himself. What about Peter? Walking there on the water. If you've heard the story taught, you'll have heard it taught, that he has his eyes fixed on Jesus, but then he takes his eyes off Jesus. He looks at the waves. He looks at the sea beneath him. He looks in at himself and he begins to sink. Well, where does he turn? In his doubt, in his drama, he calls out to Jesus, Jesus, rescue me. And what about these disciples here in Matthew 28? Up on the mountain, worshipping and doubting. Well, they're there. Doubts and all, they have gathered, they have come to Jesus to listen to what he has to say. And there can really be no greater lesson for us than this, that when we have our questions, we should be diligent, we should do our study, we should be open and honest about them with one another. We might be able to serve one another and help one another and pick one another up. But the very one thing that we have to do is bring our questions, bring our doubt, bring the friction that exists in our lives to him. Bring them to him. Be open and honest, first and foremost with him, the one who is truth.